Hello everyone, welcome to IBIS 130. This is Professor Li Huangwen from International Business Department. This week we have been learning globalization and environment. In chapter 12 of your textbook, Fechner has described extensively about the history of global environmental regime, from the creation of Environmental Protection Agency and the Earth Day in 1970 in the United States, to UN Stockholm Declaration in 1972, to many environmental agencies created under UN and numerous international NGOs that tackle specific environmental issues such as global warming, ozone depletion, etc., etc. It's clear we have made a lot of progress in environmental issues, but we still have a tremendous challenge throughout the world. In many parts of the country, we know that environmental protection has given way to rapid economic development. We have to act now to sustain the ecosystems and to figure out a smarter way of doing things. One individual that has done both of these things is Dr. Stuart Weiss. Today we are honored to have Dr. Weiss to be here talking with us about his work. Hi, Dr. Weiss.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for being here with us.
You're welcome.
So can you tell us a little bit of what you do, who you are?
Okay. I'm Dr. Stuart Weiss. I'm a conservation ecologist. And what conservation ecologists do is science to conserve the biological diversity of the planet. I do research, I work with policy people, I take people on tours of beautiful places, educate people, and find ways to address some of the really critical environmental issues of our time.
That sounds very interesting.
Well, today we're at a very special place. It's called Edgewood Natural Preserve. It's in San Mateo County, California. And what makes this place special really starts literally with the bedrock. We're on an outcrop of serpentine rock, which is the state rock of California. That'll be on your trivia quiz. And it turns into a very, very nutrient-poor soil where special plants grow. And these are plants that used to be all over California grasslands, but got crowded out by a lot of invasive species that came in with the Spanish and the Americans in the 1700s and 1800s. So the very nutrient-poor soils have created this refuge for this native grassland flora and fauna.
So how do you preserve this ecosystem here? Can you tell us a little bit more about who's involved, how you're going to get the funding, etc.?
Okay. The key to this place is called the Bay checker spot butterfly. And the Bay checker spot butterfly is listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act, which was passed in 1973 in the wake of Earth Day. Because of its status as a threatened species, it has legal protection, which means that you can't do things here like build a golf course or build a housing development. And this area became a county park and natural preserve back in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, it was designated specifically as a natural preserve, largely because of the serpentine soils and the serpentine grassland and the presence of the Bay checker spot butterfly. So what we do with the butterfly is we monitor the populations, we make sure it's still here, figure out about how many are out here, and we observe what's happening in the habitat. So I'd been doing that for quite a long time, almost 2 decades, and starting in 1998, we noticed this really severe decline in the butterfly population here. It went from somewhere around 5,000 butterflies in 1997 down to 0 in 2002.
Zero.
Zero, yeah, extinction, local extinction. So the population is gone. Turns out that the nearest other population of bay checker spot butterflies is about 40 miles south of here in South San Jose across Silicon Valley. So having butterflies come back here naturally was really out of the question. And this is a remnant of what were literally hundreds of acres of this habitat across the San Francisco Peninsula. And we're on this 35-acre area, which is the largest intact remnant. And because of its size, this is where the checker spot butterfly lasted the longest. But alas, it went extinct.
So who's involved? Who is making this work possible?
We get funding from a lot of different sources. I brought the butterfly's decline to the attention of the county park system, and a ranger, Ricardo Trejo, said, "This is very interesting. Let's figure out something we can do." So we got a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to do an investigation of why the butterfly went extinct and what could we do to bring it back, and did we have to manage the habitat. So we did several years of work, and we found out a number of really interesting things. One, the source of the problem here is Highway 280 in the background here. Now, Highway 280 took out some of the habitat, but it has a much broader effect. Every car going by on Highway 280 is leaving a little bit of nitrogen oxide and ammonia behind, and those gases blow across the freeway into the habitat, and they act as fertilizer. They act as nitrogen fertilizer. You know, just like you go to your garden store and you get a big bag of nitrogen fertilizer, we found that right by the freeway fence, the cumulative impact of 100,000 plus cars going by every day at pretty high speeds was the equivalent of dumping about 15 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year into this very nutrient-poor habitat. Now, when you do that, you change the balance in the habitat. So suddenly, it's not so nutrient poor anymore, and a number of species can come in and crowd out the plants that the checker spot butterfly needs. So I wanted to show you this plant. This is called dwarf plantain. And for the checker spot butterfly, this is the most important plant in the world. This is what they eat as a caterpillar. Now, most butterflies, and actually most insects that eat plants, are very specific to certain groups of plants. And that's a long-term coevolution between insects and the plants they feed on that's been playing out for tens of millions of years. So this little diminutive plant provides the caterpillar food. And when we add nitrogen into the habitat, we create conditions so that some other species can really dominate the habitat and crowd out the little dwarf plantain. So when we add all this nitrogen to the habitat, this plant, called Italian ryegrass, which is an introduced plant into California, it came in with the Spaniards back in the 1700s, can suddenly grow tall and lush and crowd out the little dwarf plantain. So what we saw was that this wave of the Italian ryegrass grew out from the freeway about 400 meters, 400 yards, and crowded out the plants a butterfly needs, and that's why the butterfly population went extinct. Now, it's a little more complicated than that. There's a deeper history here of the pollution control we put on our cars. So back in the early 1990s, we started putting on these catalytic converters to decrease the amount of nitrogen oxides coming out, because nitrogen oxides are a precursor to ozone and it's a regulated pollutant. But when we put the catalytic converters on, there was an unintended byproduct, and it was ammonia gas. And ammonia is a very potent fertilizer. So we had the nitrogen oxides going down, which is a great thing, but suddenly the ammonia ramped up. And then about 10 years after that started, it reached this critical threshold where the fertilizer effect had gotten to the point where the Italian ryegrass just completely dominated the habitat, and that's when the butterfly population declined. So it was this technological change in response to air pollution control of the nitrogen oxides and the volatile organic matter and the carbon monoxide. We had this unintended byproduct of ammonia that really ramped up the fertilization out here.
How's your progress?
We discovered what had happened. We figured out how to manage the habitat, and we'll be seeing that a little bit later. And we started attempting to reintroduce the butterfly here once we had treated enough of the habitat. So reintroducing the butterfly involved going down to the really large populations in South San Jose, collecting a lot of these little black furry larvae. They really are warm and fuzzy. And bringing them up. So we tried in 2009 with 1,000 of these little caterpillars, and turned out it didn't work the first time because we picked a really dry year, and that was just luck at the draw. We waited a few years, and then starting in 2011, we decided we were going to use more caterpillars and do it over a longer time period. So we bring up 4,000 or 5,000 caterpillars each year in February or March. We let them loose, and then we see how many adult butterflies we see. We have a group of volunteers from the Friends of Edgewood that we call the checker spotters. So this is what we call citizen science, and they have their day of the week, and they walk about a 1.5 kilometer course out here spotting checker spots. So we can answer the question, how many checker spots could a checker spotter spot if a checker spotter could spot checker spots?
I love that.
Yeah, we love it too. We do this with a lot of good humor, and people are really, really excited about it. And we're getting really good data because every day we get a count of the butterflies. We can see when they start emerging, when the flight season peaks, and when they fade out. Now, right now, we're past the season of flight. That ended about a week ago with the very last individuals that we saw. It's very fleeting. You know, one of the things being an ecologist is you have to be in the right place at the right time because these are very, very seasonal environments. And there's just a short window, sometimes of just a few weeks, when you'll be able to find the organisms in the right life stage. So in order to do this, we've gotten funding from a lot of different organizations. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which administers the Endangered Species Act, San Mateo County, the San Mateo County Parks Foundation, the Friends of Edgewood, who have also contributed a lot of volunteer time. So it's a lot of people just rallying around the checker spot butterfly. And you may ask, well, why is everybody so excited about the butterfly? Well, there's a lot of reasons here. One is it is a legally protected species. We, as a society in the United States in 1973, said very eloquently in the Endangered Species Act that these things matter. The full force of law of the federal government will go towards protecting these really unique species that are in danger of going extinct. And it's almost a cliche now, but extinction is forever. Once it's gone, it's gone. And all of the benefits that we as human beings can garner from species are gone, whether it's just the appreciation of the beauty, whether it's the scientific knowledge we get by studying how an insect that's feeding on plants works. Why do populations boom and bust? Because we have a lot of insects eating plants we care deeply about, our food crops. Right. So understanding how insect populations work is really important. Every species is a genetic library that we're just barely beginning to learn how to read. And once that genetics are gone, we have no way of reconstructing them.
Well, thank you so much for doing this for our environment. So this seemed to be a local phenomena, but I guess the similar things are happening all over the world. Can you tell us a little bit how this has become a global issue and how we get here? Where are we going from here?
Yeah, sure. The nitrogen pollution issue is probably the most severe global environmental change that nobody's ever heard of. But nitrogen pollution is pervasive around the world. We have examples here in the United States where every year there's a dead zone at the mouth of the Mississippi River that's a result of nitrate runoff from the Midwest. Chesapeake Bay turns into algal soup in certain parts of the bay because of all the nitrogen runoff. Beautiful Lake Tahoe has lost a lot of its clarity because of this atmospheric deposition from air pollution falling onto the surfaces. You go to coastal environments off of China and off the mouth of the Yangtze River and the major river systems of China, there's dead zones. These coastal dead zones have been increasing exponentially around the world. And on balance, the nitrogen cycle is the most disrupted biogeochemical cycle, basically the physiology of the planet. In some senses, far more disrupted than the carbon cycle is. And the nitrogen cycle also plays into global warming. Nitrous oxide is a very powerful greenhouse gas. The production of ozone is dependent on nitrogen oxides. And it's just an example of how integrated the overall ecosystem is. Because ecosystems are very, very careful with their nitrogen. And what's happening now is we've put so much nitrogen into the biosphere that it's leaking out. So what happens with nitrogen is that we get some NOx coming off the cars. It gets absorbed by the ryegrass. The ryegrass decomposes. That bit of nitrogen goes into the soil, turns into some nitrate, gets flushed out of the system below the rooting zone, goes into the groundwater, comes out in a stream somewhere, helps create an algal bloom there, ends up in our local reservoir. Then it might get re-emitted back to the atmosphere and go somewhere else. And the nitrogen just keeps cycling around and around, having both positive but a lot of negative consequences. It's really too much of a good thing, which is the way it is with a lot of pollution. A little bit good, but we've just exceeded the amounts that these ecosystems can absorb. And eventually it becomes what we call denitrified, which it goes back into the atmosphere as very inert nitrogen gas. So the impacts worldwide are losses of biological diversity, like we saw here, coastal pollution, water quality issues, a lot of human health issues. So one interesting chain of events is this Italian ryegrass puts out a lot of pollen. It's very allergenic pollen. So a lot of people are allergic to it. And when it gets excess nitrogen, and not only grows taller, it puts out a lot more pollen. So who would have thought that driving a car by on Highway 280 would make a contribution to somebody having a sneezing attack out here? And that's the way ecology and the biosphere work. There's this web of interconnections that can take a lot of effort to untangle, but they have effects that are so far-ranging. You know, who would have thought that a change in catalytic converter technology back in the 1990s would lead to the disappearance of the bay checker spot butterfly from this site?
Wow, that sounds so interesting. Thank you so much again for doing all this work for our environment.
Thanks, it's a pleasure. I can't believe I actually get paid to do this.
Yeah. Dr. Weiss, can you tell us a little bit about the research about conserving the butterflies?
Yeah, we do a lot of different counting of the caterpillars and the adult butterflies. We monitor the composition of the plant community out here, which is how we were able to document the invasion of the grass and the decline of the dwarf plantain. And we used little 1/2 by 1/2 meter frames and look very closely at the grassland. And when you look really closely at the grassland, it's just fascinating, because in a single 1/2 by 1/2 meter, sometimes you'll get 20 different plant species. It's a very, very rich environment out here with a lot of different species. We measure the amount of nitrogen gases in the air using some very simple technology called passive samplers. So an example would be we've put samplers on the freeway fence back there. We had one about 400 meters off the freeway, and we were able to see what the gradient of the nitrogen concentrations were in the air. And we bring all those threads together and use a lot of the previous research that's been done on these serpentine grassland ecosystems to get a fuller picture of exactly what's happening. Now, for the remediation of the problem, we did a lot of experiments. We tried some goat grazing, we tried to do some controlled burning, but we couldn't do the burning because of regulations and bad weather. We finally settled on mowing. We do a mow just this time of year when the grasses have not fully ripened their seeds, but most of the other wildflowers, including the plantain, have matured their seeds and dropped, and we come in and we mow down the grass. And that kills off a lot of the seed production, disturbs a lot of the soil surface, and makes a lot of good habitat for the little wildflowers. And the following year we come back and we see that we've created a lot more flowers and a lot less grass. So in an area like this, we have this mosaic of mow plots and unmowed plots. We don't want to mow the whole habitat every year. So we do this rotational mowing here, and that's been going on since about 2004 and 2005. And that's what maintains the butterfly habitat, because the pollution from the freeway is not going away for quite a while. It will eventually decline to the point where we don't have to do it because of strong regulations by the California Air Resources Board and the Environmental Protection Agency, and the technological changes in our vehicles in response to that. So this area was mowed just last week. This is our major management strategy out here. And it looks like, wow, you took out all the wildflowers. But then we can see what the effect will be like next year. And we expect it to look a lot like this just full of these little wildflowers, including the dwarf plantain and the flowers that the adult butterflies use nectar. And if we look a little further over here, this is an area that hasn't been mowed or wasn't mowed last year. And you can see how many fewer flowers and more grass there is over here. This is a beautiful outcrop of serpentine rock festooned with flowers. And I think one of the great values that we all implicitly recognize with nature is the beauty of nature. And all these environmental impacts we're talking about on a global scale are reducing these beautiful spots to very homogeneous, boring ecosystems.
Hi, we're at the vineyard in Northern California. Dr. Weiss, what do you do here?
Well, here we're looking at climate and weather and its effect on fine wine grapes. There are few crops that we grow that are as finely tuned to a particular climate as wine grapes. All those different varieties you see on the shelves, Pinot Noir to Cabernet Sauvignon to Zinfandel, Chardonnay, each of those varieties has a certain climate where it best expresses itself and makes good wine. It's the quality of the grapes that really defines the ability to make good wine, because you can't make good wine from bad grapes. The wine industry likes to say that great wine starts in the vineyard. So what we do is we analyze the climate of a site. We look at what the weather is around it. Is it in a cool climate? Is it in a warmer climate? So a cool climate would be close to the coast. A warm climate would be further inland. And what's great in Northern California is that we have so many different climates in the different parts of the region, ranging from the Sonoma coast to the inland parts of Napa County. Very wide range of climates. And the wine industry in California is very large and very distinguished. And a lot of that is because we have the right climates for the right grapes. So in Europe, where they've been growing wine grapes for millennia, they figured it out over centuries what wine grapes grow best in certain places. In California, we get sort of a fresh start. So figuring out the right grape variety to plant in a particular site, and then also how do you manage that vineyard? How do you trellis up the grapes so that you get the right amount of sun on the grapes, so the grapes themselves are at the right temperature? It's not just about what temperature the air is. It's about the true microclimate inside the canopy of the grapevine here where the grapes are developing. So we take a lot of the methods that I use to analyze butterfly habitat for climate and we apply it to vineyards. A few examples of what we do is we'll stick little temperature sensors in the developing grape clusters. And that way we know what the most important temperature in the vineyard is, which is the temperature of the grape clusters. We can analyze the structure of the grapevine canopy using a photographic technique called hemispherical photography. And that lets us know when is the sun shining on the grapes at different times of the year. And that's very dynamic because the path of the sun changes with the seasons, and sometimes it's really high in the sky, sometimes it's really low. The types of responses from the vineyard we're most interested in looking at is, are the grapes ripening evenly on either side of the trellis? Are the grapes exposed to the afternoon sun getting too hot during a big heat wave? Is the canopy of the grapevine which is where the photosynthesis is creating all the sugar, is that balanced with the number of grape clusters you have to? It's all very, very detailed. And we provide this level of information to growers so they can better manage their vineyards.
So that's a part of your company's business, main business, right? I hear you got a new business going.
Yeah, I started a company called Viticision. Vita is grapes, basically. And we've worked with quite a few wineries in California, including J. Lohr. We just happened to have a bottle of J. Lohr Seven Oaks Cabernet Sauvignon, and we worked in the vineyards that produced this. Now, the wine industry is very interesting. It's very tiered. So what they're aiming for in this wine is very high volume, but very high quality for the price. And that's where J. Lohr, that's their strategy. So this is one of the largest Cabernet Sauvignon brands in California, and it's in that middle price tier. It's not the $2 Chuck. It's also not the $90 to $100 or more Napa Cabernet cult wines. So we worked with J. Lohr. We investigated a series of vineyards down in Paso Robles, which is on the central coast of California. And we were able to make some recommendations on the way they manage their canopies, figure out why a couple of their vineyard blocks weren't producing very well. They weren't producing grapes of high enough quality to go into this wine. And when that happens, they have to put it into the lower tier of their wines. So, in the course of taking all this butterfly microclimate work into the wine industry, I learned a lot about the structure of the industry and how you have bulk wines, and then how you have these very, very precisely grown and fermented single vineyard wines that go for a lot of money. Now, the wine industry is a global industry. There are millions of acres of wine grapes planted worldwide. And the evolution of that industry in an era of rapid climate change is going to be really, really interesting. Because, good example, in France, they've figured out that Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are the grapes that grow best in Burgundy. And by law, those are the grapes that they have to grow there if they're going to call it Burgundy. But when the climate in Burgundy becomes more like the climate in southern France, with the rise in temperatures and changes in rainfall patterns, Pinot Noir won't do very well there, and there'll be somewhere else where the Pinot Noir is appropriate. And it suddenly becomes a moving target. The climate is not stable anymore. And the grape growers are going to have to learn how to adapt to it. Now, there's a lot of ways to adapt to it. You could change the trellis system so that you get more shade on the grapes. You can plant at a different density. You can trim. You can irrigate in a certain way. But at some point, the vineyard just won't be suitable for that variety at that site. So then you can change varieties. You can change varieties by cutting off all of the existing buds and regrafting to a different variety. So say this were Pinot Noir and it was getting too warm at this site for Pinot Noir to produce consistently high quality wine. Well, what do? Well, you can take off all the Pinot Noir clones, graft onto the rootstock a different variety, maybe Merlot, which can tolerate a little bit warmer temperature, or Cabernet Sauvignon. But these are the types of decisions where you're making a 30-year investment. So the life of a vineyard is typically on the order of 25 to 30 years. So that's the pace at which you need to understand the way the climate is changing.
Mm-hmm. You know, climate is changing and it continues to change. What do you see the implication of your business to other crops?
Yeah, well, every agricultural crop is very sensitive to temperature and water supply. So if we can map out where the appropriate spots are, and grapevines are a really good example because they're so sensitive to it, but other crops can be just as sensitive. We can track the climate better. So you could have certain crops moving closer to the coast. Or you have to abandon some crops, like fruit trees require a certain amount of chilling hours. And in California, the cherry crop in certain parts of the state has just not been getting enough chilling hours, and you get a lousy cherry crop when it's not cold enough for long enough in the wintertime to really shut the plants down. So understanding how those odds evolve through time for a whole lot of different crops. Another project I'm working on is on mountain agriculture. Because when you get into mountains, the climates are all packed in really close to each other, that you can go across the canyon and be in a very different climate over a couple of 100 meters distance. And there are also areas where a lot of the indigenous crops, say from the Andes or from the mountains in Asia, still have a lot of the genetic diversity. I mean, we've really reduced the genetic diversity in our crops, especially our major food crops, in pursuit of ever higher consistent production. But that loss of diversity is really threatening the long-term suitability of our food system to support, 7.5 billion people. It's going to be 10 billion people by the end of the century. So by understanding the interactions of plants, our crop plants in particular, with the weather and the climate, we can make better decisions and help feed the world, and also keep producing good wine. Because we can't all be focused on we can't all be focused on the staples of life. We need to have the finer things in life. One at a time. There you go. And I think we'll just finish up our little interview with a taste of this fine J. Lohr Seven Oaks Cabernet Sauvignon.
Dr. Weiss, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
L'chaim.
Cheers. One final request. As an environmentalist, do you have a few final words to say to our students?
Yes, I do. We are utterly dependent on the ecosystems of planet Earth for our well-being. And we need to learn how to take care of the Earth, not pollute it, not overexploit it. Take advantage of the richness of life that we've inherited from previous generations and from 4.5 billion years of evolution, and not trash the place.
Thank you so much. Cheers.